Welcome to today's webinar, How Basic Income Can Drive Economic Recovery, Jobs, and Poverty Reduction. My name is Natasha Pei, and I'm the manager of Cities for Cities Reducing Poverty. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on Indigenous land. As settlers, it's important to recognize the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous people and affirm our collective commitment to make the promise and challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. I'm calling in today from the traditional unceded territory of Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I invite each of you to introduce yourself in the chat box, including the traditional land in which you are calling from. And while you're introducing yourselves, I'd like to introduce you to our guest moderator today, Laurie Montse-Broughton. Laurie is a former social justice reporter for the Toronto Star, where she wrote about poverty, inequality, and social programs, including welfare, childcare, children's aid, and disabilities rights. She's also covered Ontario's ill-fated Basic Income Pilot Project. Laurie's other interests include affordable housing and the plight of low-wage, non-standard workers. A Star reporter for 37 years, Laurie's work has received numerous National Newspaper Award nominations and has garnered 3 citations of merit from the prestigious Michener Award and Public Service Journalism. Thank you for leading today's conversation, Laurie, and thanks to Tom Cooper and the partners at Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction for helping to set up today's discussion. I will now turn it over to you to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Natasha, and thanks to everyone for turning out today for what I believe is going to be a very interesting and informative discussion. And we have a very experienced and passionate panel to lead us. And I'm going to get started in my introductions with Brett House, who is the Vice President and Deputy Chief Economist at Scotiabank. Previously, Brett was Chief Economist at an alternative investment management startup in Toronto and Global Strategist at Woodbine Capital Advisors. Earlier in his career, Brett served as Principal Advisor in the Executive Office of the United Nations Secretary General and as an economist at the International Monetary Fund. He received the 2014 Quebec Notable Award in Finance, the 2015 Good Citizen Award from his hometown of Lincoln, Ontario, the 2018 Professional Leader Award from Start Proud, and was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. Welcome, Brett. Floyd Marinescu is CEO and co-founder of C4 Medium. The company provides software development news and learning events serving 1.2 million people online on infoq.com and 8,000 QCon conference attendees annually from San Francisco, New York, London, Beijing, Shanghai, and Sao Paulo. Floyd is an angel investor in over a dozen startups and has built teams and businesses in the US, Canada, China, Brazil, and Europe. Floyd is also a CEO activist for Universal Basic Income. Welcome, Floyd. Paul Smetanin is the president of the Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis, an interdisciplinary research group using AI and advanced data science techniques to uncover the risks and rewards behind questions of socioeconomic prosperity and sustainability across Canada. With over 3 decades of experience bridging the divide between evidence-based analysis and decision-making at the highest levels of KPMG, the Industrial Bank of Japan, and the Australia-New Zealand Bank, Paul's expertise in risk management and behavior economics puts the unintended consequences of policy and program choices at the forefront for Canadian decision-makers. Thank you all for joining today's webinar. We're going to get started with some opening remarks from each of our panelists to get things moving. And I turn it over to you, Paul, to get started.
Sure, thank you. So we were asked to look at, objectively look at the question of guaranteed minimum income, what families would be beneficiaries of 2 particular programs, and what might be the potential economic impacts of the programs, and how is that actually shaped by funding. So the study is meant to sort of assist the discussion and debate around how a guaranteed minimum income could be funded in a way that may be beneficial for the economy. So one of the conclusions from our work is that while a guaranteed minimum income could be justified on social and equitable grounds, it can also be thought of as an investment as a desirable side effect could be economic growth. However, that is dependent upon the way it is funded. There are also some basic assumptions in the analysis that households that receive guaranteed minimum income will actually spend their disposable income at the same rate as other households at the same income bracket, and that the wealthy will pay their taxes and not try and avoid the impost that would be required from a guaranteed minimum income. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to everyone's questions.
Thanks, Paul. Brett, we're calling on you to put the economic lens on why basic income is urgent.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks to the Tamarack Institute for convening this conversation. I think there's some real urgency to look at basic income as a way to ensure that we provide and guarantee as an insurance in our social safety net a basic level of well-being for all Canadians right now, in part as we move through the pandemic and its economic impacts. We are seeing that we're all in the same storm, but as others have noted, we're in very different boats. The biggest employment and household income impacts from the shutdowns that have been brought forward to control contagion have been concentrated in low-income households, minimum wage jobs, and sectors of the economy where incomes and jobs are the most precarious in services, entertainment, hospitality, tourism, and other related parts of the economy. And we're going to see continued impairment in those sectors for some time as physical distancing is likely to remain a brake on their recovery through this year and possibly into 2022 as well. So we know that the CERB and other measures like the Canada Child Benefit have been really instrumental in maintaining stable incomes for those households and sustaining them through the pandemic. And that really provides us the basis for discussing basic income as something that's already being done in the Canadian policy framework and how we might extend some of the lessons and insights from it over the last few years. One of the big questions that comes up over the discussion of basic income is how to pay for it. And one of the things I'd like to sort of put as a hallmark of our discussion is that it need not be paid for immediately. We need to look at the entire constellation of costs and benefits around basic income and essentially consider the horizon of those costs and benefits in net present value terms and look at how basic income can be financed over the next decade potentially or multiple decades rather than expecting it to produce so many benefits in 1 year that it pays for itself immediately. And so we need to be modest in our expectations of the financing around it and realistic in terms of that entire horizon of how costs and benefits are likely to shake out as we bring forward changes to our social safety net.
Thank you, Brett. And to you, Floyd, you've been the headliner advocate on this issue for some time now. Tell us a little bit about individual business and shared aspiration behind a basic income as you see it.
Well, the entrepreneurial decision to produce something depends on their expectations of future sales. And how exciting is it that this new report from CANCEA shows that we can actually address poverty while also stimulate economic growth, creating 300,000 to 600,000 jobs, adding $80 billion to Canada's GDP, potentially, depending on how it's funded. This is big news. The idea that we can think of basic income as an investment and break the discussion away from only being seen in a welfare reform or anti-poverty lens. This is a shared aspiration for the well-being of the business community and people alike. And it's really important that we start to discuss it that way because I think people in Canada, in fact, across Western countries are in what I'm beginning to call the big squeeze. People's incomes, their real disposable income is being squeezed by rising land values from below. That's driving more higher cost of living, increasing rents, increasing payments out of people's incomes, going to mortgage debts. and from the top being pushed down by technology, advances in automation that is displacing jobs, stagnating wage growth, and disconnecting economic growth and productivity growth from people's real wage growth, especially for the bottom 60%. And we can see this now in fast motion. Economic crises are our trend accelerator. Whenever this happens, every time this happens, businesses try to do more with less in order to survive. And they reach out for all the technologies that are around that they didn't bother investing in or didn't have the urgency to invest in when times are good. And we see massive and rapid automation of jobs. We're seeing it right now. So before the pandemic, 42% of the tasks Canadians do at work was easily automatable with technology that is cheaper than workers. And we're seeing it now in warehouses, in the banks, we're seeing it in retail, we're seeing it everywhere. And this is a real concern. The big squeeze from both sides is only going to accelerate. We're seeing what's happening with the housing market. We're seeing what's happening with AI and automation coming down the line. So we need a solution. We need a way to immediately address the consequences of these two trends. And basic income is not a panacea. It's not the only solution, but it has to be the beginning of one. Because as we move through this, people need time. They need time to reach out for better work. They need time out of poverty to retrain. And I just can't think of anything other than a basic income that could do that. And the good news is we could see from this report from CANCEA that it could also be very positive for the economy. So what's not to like?
Thanks, Floyd. Indeed, what is not to like? In fact, it almost seems too good to be true, particularly with this new report. But the question that often comes up, certainly among social justice advocates and folks who work with vulnerable populations, is can we do it all? And if we shifted such a huge amount of money, tens of billions, into a basic income, just spread it across the country, what would happen to our social programs, programs that specifically target folks with disabilities or other vulnerable groups who really they need more than extra money in the bank. They need the human contact, the supports, the training, the general assistance. Can we do both? Paul?
Well, we weren't looking at this question of looking at other programs and whether other programs are affected by the guaranteed minimum income. I actually think Brett's probably a better person to ask that question.
Take it away, Brett.
Sure, happy to come in on that. And in some ways, I'll build on the report from the BC panel on a basic income that looked at, a number of measures that could be brought forward. The headline on that panel's discussion was basic income not the best way forward for British Columbia. But in fact, when you dig into the specific recommendations, they are advocating a combination of changes and adjustments to a variety of benefits, married with, for some people, a basic income or an enhancement of what are already basic income policies. So I think that report, building on other research that we've seen, does make the case for the notion of income security at a stable and non-volatile level where people have an expectation of what the support flows are going to be going forward to them that allows them to plan and build their lives around those numbers so that they can either pursue training, relocation, or other ways that they can improve their well-being. And it recognizes that some people are not going to be entirely served by a basic income, and there may need to be additional changes and support measures that go above and beyond what a basic income can provide. And to some extent, UBI Works has highlighted that issue too in looking at what they've called a recovery basic income that builds on and ensures that people's existing levels of support would not be compromised by a move to a basic income framework. So, I think, again, keeping in mind the objective that, we're trying to ensure at least a basic level of well-being for all Canadians, and then looking at a menu of options, including basic income, to ensure that is one way to frame our discussion going forward.
Lloyd, any follow-up thoughts?
Yeah, there's a fallacy in the debate around basic income that it's basic income or public services. This is just a made-up discussion. I don't understand where this trade-off discussions come from. A dollar is a dollar if it comes from one program or 200 programs. I think most people who are receiving public support would rather get as much of it as possible in an unconditional manner, and we can build the other supports that we have on top of a basic income where it's needed. Money will not replace a wheel-trans bus, will not replace social workers or mental health therapists, but a national unconditional basic income will reduce stigma, will reduce work disincentives, and will improve the access to the funds that people need. So why not have a national basic income and then build all the additional supports required for specific target communities on top of it? Doing that would be a lot cheaper and a lot more effective.
And I think that's the focus of the report is the cost, and I guess the argument is that that we can afford it, with the impact of the economic opportunity that comes with a basic income. So how does a basic income, I know you've touched on this, Floyd, impact the labor market and labor market participation and good employment opportunities? There's a sense that if everyone's getting a basic income, then a lot of these low-wage employers don't have to increase their wages because they know that the person they're employing already has a basic income. How do we deal with the impact on good jobs? How do we create good jobs if we're already paying people to, as some would say, stay home?
Yeah, there's a couple of fallacies also circulating on this one. One is that people won't work because they have a basic income. A reminder that it is basic. And another fallacy is that, well, we're subsidizing a corporation so they don't have to pay as much. Both these fallacies just reflect a very negative view of the human condition. If you look at the actual data, what we see, for instance, just recently now in Stockton, a small pilot they had there, people who received a small basic income were twice as much likely to find work than those who didn't. We saw in Alaska, where they're sharing oil rents through dividends, that it didn't have a negative impact on labor market participation, but it actually improved the number of people working part-time, increased by 20%. Here in Canada, the Canada Child Benefit is the largest basic income program in a sense in the world. In the world, over 600,000 families are getting more than $1,000 a month. For instance, over 1 million families are getting more than $600 a month. That's been studied and has shown no negative impact on labor force participation. And on the issue of businesses being subsidized, I think that just falls to basic analysis. If someone knows they have a guaranteed income, they can hold out for better pay. They can leave jobs that don't reflect their needs. And we've seen evidence from pilots that people do seek out better work. Most recently with the CERB, we saw no evidence in the aggregate, and Brett can speak to this better than I can, that even people making less than $2,000 a month didn't go back to work. So these two issues are fallacies and reflect again a misunderstanding that, first of all, it is a basic income. It's enough to keep people above poverty so they can participate fully in society, including seeking better work and also saying no to poor work.
Brett, I wonder if you could answer that question, but speak to from an employer's perspective, that if suddenly if workers can say no or to low-paying jobs, is this going to impact employers and the type of jobs that are out there?
Well, of course, we've all heard the anecdotes about medium and small business owners or managers talking about the difficulty they've had in some cases in getting specific employees back to work during the pandemic and the provision of the CERB and other direct payment supports. But I won't deny the veracity of any of those stories. I'm sure they reflect real lived experience. At the same time, though, we have good data from StatCan that reflects millions of people's lived experience. And we know from that data where sectors like those I mentioned that are minimum wage dominated in the service sector, that have been the slowest to reactivate and reopen, where they have reopened, we have seen in the aggregate workers come back to existing jobs or to new jobs in those areas. They have not been shirking when we look at the aggregate numbers. And in part, that's because they know it is, under the current system, more reliable to be in paid employment over the medium to longer term than to be relying on a government benefit that could be withdrawn at any time. And so, as we go forward, we are likely to see, the biggest numbers of returnees to work continue to be in those low wage sectors, where one would have thought, if there were massive disincentive effects from the CERB and its successor, we wouldn't see people going back to work at all, or we would see enormous upward pressure on wages, which so far we haven't seen yet either.
But I think, just to follow up, I think it's because most people don't expect the CERB to continue, that the money is going to disappear. So if we move to a basic income that's going to be guaranteed, guaranteed income, does that, are you worried about that changing, or is there something else going on?
Well, I think, the level of the basic income and the guarantees that are provided around it have to be carefully calibrated. We also have to look at what happens on the tax system in terms of any clawbacks of basic incomes and the incentives and disincentives those might provide. It's important to think about the entire system to consider how it may encourage or discourage people from moving into paid employment. But we do know that in the main, when people are offered good work at a fair wage, they do tend to take up those possibilities. There is a just basic human need, and I'm stepping out of my lane as an economist more into the sociological. I think there is a real impetus for people to feel useful and do useful things, to contribute meaningfully in their communities in the broader sense. And there are very, very few people, whether it's in Canada or in other studies of direct cash transfers to people, where they do nothing. And in general, whether we're looking at very low wage economies or much higher wage economies, when people are given direct cash transfers that take them to or slightly above the poverty line, they tend to invest in entrepreneurial opportunities, retraining, improving their living conditions. The rate of recidivism, shirking, or otherwise wasting funds is no higher than what we see under more contingent and conditional welfare-based or other, sort of needs-based or other systems that, rather than providing a guarantee or an automatic cash transfer, couch everything in a number of triggers.
I want to add a couple of things. This has been studied. A meta-study of almost all the basic income pilots in the last 50 years showed no meaningful decline in labor force participation, except a little bit for the second earner who wanted to take care of the kids, or students who stayed in school longer. Over 105,000 people across an aggregate, across all these pilots, kept working. So I think these concerns are overblown. And another kind of pitfall in these discussions that they seem to always focus on the decisions of the individual. But what about the impacts on the community? Basic income is an investment of millions of dollars in small towns, much more than that in larger cities. That's why I'm very excited about this new report from CANCEA, because it shows the systemic effects. It shows the impact of this money circulating from the bottom up in the economy, potentially in Canada, being able to create 300,000 to 600,000 jobs. So the impact on the community of better jobs being offered and available is even more important, I believe, than the individual decision and concerns about if someone will work or not.
Paul, you're the author of the report. Are our other panelists reading the right thing into it?
I believe so. And in fact, I have a colleague who's also an author of the report, David Stiff, with us today. But essentially, a guaranteed minimum income, for which you're calling it a basic income, we studied a guaranteed minimum income. These two programs are actually, they're targeted. They're not a general programs, and you can show that under certain funding arrangements, eventually these programs can be self-sustaining. And what that means is that the government does not have to rely upon debt in order to be able to drive these programs. Now, clearly, there will need to be funds that are raised from participants within the economy that have capacity to pay. And I think for some, the concern is that these households will try and minimize their tax burdens or move money offshore. We don't know what the answer to that is. What we do know is that if we look at the economy and we look at the circular nature of the funds as it swirls around the economy, that this actually could be good for the economy. I wouldn't sort of stress it as a recovery program because there are other programs that economists are very well aware of that could actually do a better job if the objective is to create jobs. But I think, and this is coming back to Brett's comments, is that when you're looking at guaranteed minimum income, it's really first and foremost justified on social and equitable grounds. Our work is essentially saying you don't have to actually penalize the economy at the same time, but it's not instantaneous. It does take over a decade and a half before these programs actually become self-sustaining.
You. I know, Floyd, you touched on this in your opening remarks, but we often hear about a basic income being a cushion to big labor market changes and automation. And I'm just wondering, Paul, did you look at that at all in your report, or is it fair to say that it could respond to that too?
Sorry, can you just ask the question again quickly?
Sorry, speak to how a basic income is a good response to those labor market changes and automation, and as the labor market is in flux, that a basic income can help smooth it over while people need to retrain or jobs disappear entirely because of automation.
Yeah, look, we didn't look at this in any great detail. This question of whether capital is going to replace human labor within the production functions, it's definitely a concern to the extent that the way that we used to think of running a household and financing a household and aspects of careers is changing. So you can think of as a guaranteed minimum wage or a basic income as allowing or financing future consumers such that businesses can continue to sell their products to households. But I think it's probably better for, say, Brett, or it sounds like Floyd is well read on the topic, around the substitution of capital for, human labor for capital as an effect upon society. And you've also got the issues of inequality, which we understand very well in terms of it's increased massively over the past few decades. And ultimately the question becomes, from an economic point of view, when does that become unsustainable?
Brett, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. I think it's really relevant to note that basic income has a potential role to play in cushioning the impact of technological change and changes in the parts of the economy that are growing and adding jobs for Canadians. It's also important to note the really fundamental shift all of the world's economies have gone through over the last 30 years with increasingly integrated global capital and labor markets and trade markets. As we've opened up to trade, it's a foundational understanding in international economic theory that would occasion some winners and some losers, and it would likely cause some widening in wage inequality in Canada. And there was always an understanding that as we opened up with things like the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA agreements with Europe and with Asia, that we would provide support to help people retrain, either move into new sectors or move to different parts of the country where jobs are available. And we've only partially followed through on that. So, one of the real arguments for unconditional cash transfers is to ensure that people who know their situation best are able to undertake that training, make those moves, either locally or across the country, to economic opportunities that are being created and away from those that are being diminished as a result of opening up. And so it's both technological change driving part of this conversation and international economic integration. And both of those forces are growing the overall size of the Canadian economy. They're making the pie bigger, but they're also shifting the distribution of the pie. And part of the argument for increasing the size of that pie through technological change and more open markets was that we would use some of those gains to ensure that no one is left behind. And we've only partially fulfilled that promise.
And Brett, wasn't there a report to the government before signing NAFTA saying, yes, do this, but also have a basic income? I remember you or someone saying something about that. That's a really interesting story.
Honestly, I don't recall if that was part of the recommendations from the public service to the government. It may have come from, an NGO or another actor in that space. But it certainly was part of, public policy that there was a recognition, that some areas would be made less competitive and certain sectors of the economy received immediate support. But, the impact on workers is a much longer term trend that our public safety net still needs to respond to.
Yeah, so I can talk a bit about this.
Floyd.
I'll start with a personal story. My father and uncle were in Ontario's automotive manufacturing sector. And in the early 2000s, they were among the job apocalypse, where over 4 million manufacturing workers across North America lost their jobs. And while China entered the market and created a sudden income loss for local manufacturers, it's been proven, though, later on that what actually happened there was that 5 times more jobs or 6 times more jobs were lost to automation than to trade. So much like the pandemic crisis, like any economic crisis, businesses reached out for technologies around them to become more efficient, and working people suffered. So automation has another being a big fallacy in this discussion about automation. A lot of futurists say, oh yeah, long term it'll create a lot of jobs, but not for us, not for the people who lost their jobs. It might create more jobs for a future generation. But what we're seeing in the numbers is that we're actually creating more and more low quality and low income jobs. That's actually what's happening right now in Western countries and in Canada in particular. I think there's a process playing out that happened to my father and uncle. It happened to the Luddites. The Luddites who broke the looms were not against technology. They were against being pushed out of middle class incomes into subsistence incomes. Their quality of life suffered. That's why they're against the looms, and that's happening now. It's been studied by labor economists. There's a process called de-skilling that's occurring across Western countries, where university educated people are taking jobs that used to go to high school educated people because they can't find enough better jobs for them. And that's pushing high school educated people into even lower income work or out of the job market entirely. The reports that have studied de-skilling, and I've studied labor market polarization, another key thing, where we're literally dividing the job market into the haves and have-nots, where all that's left for the bottom 60% is increasingly lower skill and lower quality work. All these reports always say, yeah, technology is probably a reason, but they're not willing to confidently say that that's the main reason. But it is certainly a big factor. And other economists have studied it and shown that we're creating less new tasks for people to replace the ones that are being automated. And so overall, if there's one thing people should get about automation, is that those whose jobs are automated end up making less money later and being more in despair. And Andrew Yang, when he's running for president, was saying that of those 4 million, half of them didn't go back to work, and half of those ended up on disability supports, often falling into deaths of despair, increasing opioid addictions, because looking around them, there's not a lot of other jobs. We can see it in Hamilton. We can see it in parts around the country. In Oshawa, GM closed its auto manufacturing plants there, and they said it's because they're retooling for self-driving cars and electric cars. Retooling, my friends, means automation. It means less jobs needed. That's what that the word means, and those communities are going to suffer going forward. So at the most basic level, basic income is a good response to automation, because most basic level, it gives us time to adapt, time to seek better work, so you can reskill and retrain. You could also see it as compensation, where people whose incomes were made lower by basic income at least get an extra supplement from it so they can live a decent life. And more generously, you could see it as a form of making us beneficiaries in this adoption of modern technologies. You know, Andrew Yang ran for president on the vision that we need to make a way to make everyone beneficiaries of technological developments by making us shareholders in our economy. So depending on which basic income scheme you prefer, that's what it does to some extent. Whether it does it more for people in lower incomes or middle incomes, that depends on the scheme. So I think for us to go forward through this fourth industrial revolution that will feature rapid and massive technological change to come, we need a way to make it work for people, at least to make it work for people who've been most affected by it. In a few years, we're going to see self-driving trucks on the road, displacing the most common jobs. Elon Musk will press a button, and overnight, the entire Tesla privately owned car fleet will become a competitor to Uber and taxi drivers and delivery drivers, again, displacing one of the most common jobs available. What are we going to do? What are those people going to do? Well, we know what the Luddites did. They rioted. So what are we doing to help these people? So what's coming is going to be what's happening right now is almost on a smaller scale as the pandemic. A lot of people out of work. Thank goodness we had CERB. It wouldn't have been better if we had a basic income.
Thanks, Floyd. And I think that's a great jumping off point for to open this up to questions from the hundreds of folks who are tuning in today. We got a couple of emailed questions in advance, and so I'll just get it started with a question from a viewer. So how would you respond to those who say that social assistance reform would be a better approach? That we know social assistance is broken. Why don't we just attack that? Which was kind of what the BC panel had recommended. I'll start with you, Brett.
Well, I think there are a few things to consider. As I mentioned at the outset, I think there's certainly a possibility of marrying social assistance reform with a basic income, depending upon the objectives and the targets that we're trying to hit in our policy changes. I think the two are not incompatible with one another, particularly as we consider the specific needs of special needs or disability communities, the variation in needs across different geographies, and people who are working and studying in different sectors. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it is a combined or a hybrid, at least discussion that needs to start. And then, we'll see where both the priorities and objectives that, Canadians and policymakers want to reach get reflected in some kind of combination of the two. But again, I'd underscore, I don't think it's either or. And it may also be the case, not just of the two in tandem, but one leading to another. You can imagine a series of modifications and improvements to the social welfare safety net that ultimately implies a move in some areas or comprehensively to a full basic income provision. First and foremost, I think a basic income is about putting autonomy into people's hands rather than leaving them entirely contingent to a set of conditions and oversight, from public administrations. I think it most importantly starts from a beginning position that says people know their needs best, and let's empower them to spend money in ways that fulfill those needs.
And any of the other panelists want to comment on this? Okay, I just want to remind folks the way to ask your question is through the question box in your Zoom panel on the bottom, and I'm just scrolling through some of these now. There's a lot of fantastic questions, and here's an interesting something that actually has been rolling in my mind is that for in many cities, where certainly Toronto and other major cities where rents are just going through the roof, largely due to rent decontrol, that once somebody leaves an apartment, the landlord can charge whatever the market will bear. And I think the stats are every unit turns over every 5 years. So every 5 years, it's basically everyone's in market rent. So what are your views about the need for solid rent control as part of this basic income planning? Because the worry is that the landlords will just raise the rents and all the basic income will go into rent. Floyd, have you thought about this?
Well, there's a program in Manitoba, a basic income called Manitoba Rent Assist. And just pointing that out, that there is a basic income in Canada that it looks like a basic income, and you just press a few buttons on a web page, apply. It's very limited bureaucracy to get rental support, and that hasn't been shown to cause an increase in rent costs. The Canada Child Benefit has not been linked to increasing in rent costs. Now, if rents are going up due to other macroeconomic issues in the country, then I think, again, very much how it's funded will depend on if it can be continually improved in its ability to match inflation. And that's why I think the CANCEA report is important, because it does show a distribution of who would pay, so that we could find a way to capture some of this increasing wealth so that we can pay into a basic income in a sustainable manner.
Another question here, which often comes up, I know, in discussions about a basic income, is how would a basic income impact people who are retired or on CPP or OAS? Would someone on a pension be able to also draw the basic income, or would it be either or? How do you see that, Floyd?
I just want to invite Brett to answer the previous question about rents. I saw you were about to say something, and
Oh, I'm
I know you have
sorry,
a lot of
Brett.
insights into this.
Oh, no problem. I mean, I think the most fundamental thing to take away from a situation where, rents are too high to be affordable is that, in my mind, that represents an inconsistency between supply and demand, that, we simply don't have enough rental housing available. And it's not clear that that increase in supply is going to be put into place with significant rent controls, keeping the returns to potential development down. So, while rent controls certainly may have their place as a transitional sort of device to ensure affordability, the most fundamental thing we need to ensure when rent or other housing costs are unaffordable is an increase in supply. And unfortunately, that's often a really difficult thing to engineer, because it requires not just funding, but also requires zoning and urban planning to work in concert to actually bring that about. We know in many cities there are pressures to resist densification, resist affordable housing in many areas, and it requires coordination between multiple levels of government and private developers to ensure we get that supply response. So I think we need to think about questions like that really holistically. And as an economist, I start from supply and demand on them.
Right, and just to add to Brett's comments, is the taxation system supports some constraining of supply within the housing sector. So, just to add to the fact that rent control is not a silver bullet. There's many things that need to be revised and changed. For example, there's 27 years worth of construction sitting in empty bedrooms across Ontario right now. And that's primarily because you have empty nesters that are essentially taking advantage of the primary principal place of residence capital gains tax exemption. So there are a lot of factors involved that ultimately comes down to a supply and demand problem in that particular space.
Thank you. That was a good expansion on that. And there's a number of questions about, the impact of a basic income on inflation, and I think you've addressed some of that. But getting to retirees and seniors, I mean, that's going to be, demographics shows that that's going to be a big chunk of our population going forward. And how does the basic income impact them? Floyd, what's your worldview on this? Should pensioners be on this as well?
It depends on the scheme. So again, people who are in retirement already have a basic income. The OAS GIS system is a basic income. CPP is a form of basic income. You could compare CPP and OAS to a universal basic income where everyone gets some, and GIS is a guaranteed minimum income where you're topped up if you're on lower incomes. So this model has been well established for people who are currently retired, as well as for children, because we have the Canada Child Benefit. So where people usually discuss basic income is in the context of working age adults. We need to fill in that gap, ensure there's income security there. However, Recovery UBI, which UBI Works proposed, would extend the national basic income to seniors as well, and we see it as beneficial to consolidate and rebuild additional supports for seniors on top of national basic income. Let's get everyone on one consolidated program, which again, it reduces work disincentives and creates more national solidarity, and build additional supports on top of it where needed.
So your idea would be for this recovery basic income that people who are receiving CPP and GIS, that this would be in addition to that, or make sure that everyone has a certain amount? Could you explain a bit?
Well, all of these are income security programs. So I'm just saying that the bottom could be constituted or consolidated as a national basic income, and additional amounts people deserve because they worked hard and earned their CPP or an OAS can be, if it's above that basic income amount, they can receive that in addition from those programs. But things like the GIS, it is a guaranteed income supplement. That is what a guaranteed minimum income is. It would be replaced by a guaranteed minimum income. I think, we all know that when things go to vote, seniors have a very important impact on the outcome of votes. So if we can have a basic income that improves the lives of seniors, I think it's more likely to survive multiple elections and not be attacked in the future.
Any others panelists have thoughts on where seniors and pensioners fit in this equation?
I mean, each proposal could be structured in different ways, but I would tend to think that on a universal basic income basis, you would have to take things like the guaranteed income supplement for seniors as part of that basic income package. So whether you replace those existing basic income elements with one package, or you build up to a common level through different building blocks, through different parts of society or different demographics. I think there are arguments for and against, but I can't imagine a situation where you have GIS and OAS and then you build an entirely additional basic income on top of that, because you're already providing some of those basic income elements for seniors.
Right.
So I think it would be more of an either or than a complete and 100% add-on.
Oh,
well, I just, I can add that through the analysis that we performed in the 2 programs within the report, there were clawbacks at 50 cents for every $1 of employment revenue earned. And there was a clawback for every $1 of government transfer that you received. So, the idea of, not double dipping, if you want to call it that, is already incorporated within the programs that we were asked to evaluate at the time.
I want to answer a question that came up earlier. I mean, I brought up the question. What is the link between basic income and free trade? So in 1984, the McDonald Commission, in the context of free trade negotiations, recommended, yes, move ahead with market liberalization and free trade, but institute a guaranteed annual income for the reasons that Brett had mentioned. So we could save places like Hamilton and places like Oshawa from the impacts of this. And the government at the time chose free trade, but didn't choose basic income.
thank you. That I remember that discussion as well. a couple of people have talked about the reality that some people are just not very adept at handling their finances, their money, and that if we were to get, how would we help, or how would there be any strings attached or any support for people who may get this extra money and not spend it in their own self-interest, that it might get wasted, or I often in my reporting over the years have heard naysayers upset about homeless people that will use it on opioids and waste it. There is some. I'm just wondering, is this something that you would need to address in a campaign to convince politicians to move to a basic income, addressing that some folks aren't good money managers, and giving them more would just lead to disaster or waste?
Well, direct cash transfer programs I mentioned in both developing economies and high income economies have consistently shown there is, somewhere around a 3 to 5% rate of poor use of the funds that are distributed under those programs. But that's not substantially different from the outcomes that we see under our existing, targeted, conditional, and somewhat paternalistic social welfare programs. And so, I don't think we're looking at bigger losses, but I think the question and the anxiety around it prompts a really good conversation we could have around improving financial literacy in our educational systems, and that would be a bonus for everyone, whether we move forward with a basic income or not. I think that's got to be something that we discuss in our curriculum more generally.
In addition, it's been numerous reports have also shown reductions in crime, reductions in use of vice goods and drugs and alcohol, 42% reductions in crime, 7% less hospitalization visits was recorded in the Manitoba experiment in the 70s. Overall, I think this points to a bigger issue, is hope. People need hope, and those who have no hope, have no expectation of life getting better, often try to null that out through self-soothing things like drugs and alcohol. But when you have hope, we see in the numbers from all these trials that turns around. People start to lift themselves up. Now, that doesn't mean there's not going to be extreme cases where mental health support is required. That's why I think a country with a basic income will probably need more social workers to help people in transition to a better life. But overall, the numbers show a reduction in spending on vice and goods and things that actually hurt themselves.
And one comment in the chat that I think bears repeating: rich people waste money on drugs too. So thank you for that comment. Now, another issue that I've seen a couple of people mention is the wildly varying cost of living across the country. That a basic income of say maybe 10,000 a year to get started in Toronto would really be a drop in the bucket, whereas in a smaller community where housing isn't so expensive, it would really help. Would you foresee a basic income that is pegged to local cost of living? Is that feasible or even desirable?
I think it really depends. It is common today to have some income supports be federal and others be provincial for the same purposes. So I could imagine having a national basic income in other provinces or cities, if required, having supplements on top of it. That problem probably won't go away, and there's no reason to try and create one size fits all. But having a basic income set to be above the poverty level will also support mobility. People can move to other areas where cost of living is lower. They can work remotely from there. It could have other counterbalancing effects to this issue. But I don't think this should prevent us from moving forward with the basic income.
Yeah, from my point of view, it's I think it would be very tricky to be able to do that. And the example would be is, let's say that one province had a basic income and another province didn't. Well, then you'll find you'll get basic income migration. for example. So when you're differentiating across different regions across the country, it would be very hard to both measure and to administer the differences. I think the differences in terms of cost of living are more local issues about supply and demand. And so you turn your attention to provincial governments and municipalities and in terms of what housing options are being offered, given that housing is the largest expense of a household. Transportation is the second largest expense of the household, and with foods third. So there are other areas in which, basic income can't solve all of these. It does require some of these local issues to be addressed. And so I actually see them as outside the conversation of a basic income and trying to differentiate different levels of basic income across the country.
This is an interesting federal provincial responsibility, and some of our questionnaires are asking, advocates are saying where best to focus their advocacy. Should they be advocating at the provincial level, or are we really talking about a federal program to start? Do advocates get on board to support the basic income pilot in Prince Edward Island, for example? Where are advocates' efforts best to be placed at this moment? Where should they be focusing on?
Let's say right now, like today, the best thing you can do is call your member MP. Like, calling is better. They might answer, or their assistants will answer, but they record what happens, and it's actually pretty easy. You could just leave a voicemail and tell them to vote for Bill C-273. There's a bill that's been proposed in Parliament right now calling for a national strategy for a basic income. It'll come up for second reading. We don't know when, sometime in the next few months. It's really important that even opponents to basic income vote for it, because it'll allow it to be debated further when it goes to something called commission or committee. So that's the most important thing you can do right this moment in time. In general, I think advocating at all levels of society is really important, and getting together with local community who's interested in basic income, organizing that way. You can follow UBI Works on Facebook and Twitter. And join our email list. We're always sending people, activists, things they can do in their communities. But right now, Bill 273 is the most important thing to get the machinery of government moving. Also an important nod to Motion 46, which is also was very important to put basic income on the map. But Bill 273 will actually force the government to take some action.
Well, I'm looking at the time, and I think we're coming to the end of our discussion, and that's a great point to end on. I think it gives us some action to follow, and some areas of support to lend to this cause for those who are on board. And I'd just like to thank our presenters who attended the webinar today. It's been a very thoughtful discussion, and your answers have been really interesting. So I'll hand it over to you, Natasha. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Lori, for guiding us through today's discussion. I just wanted to direct everybody to join us again, May 5th to 6th, the End of Poverty. It's a 2-day summit brought to you live online from Calgary. We're going to be looking at 14 evidence-based pathways towards ending poverty, and basic income is going to be one of them. So you can join Sheila Regier and the Basic Income Canada Network and Tom Cooper with the Hamilton Poverty Roundtable and several more to do a deeper dive on some of these models that can help us end poverty in Canada through basic income, as well as 13 other pathways. So the registration link is in the slide here, and we'll send it to you afterwards. And we have lots of upcoming webinars through Tamarack on reducing poverty and building community, including another webinar on basic income coming up in May. So you will get that invitation. Keep a good eye on your inbox. That's all for us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Lori and Paul and Brett and Floyd and everybody who joined us today. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and we hope to see you soon.